Hey all, last part here of the tissues chapter. We're going to look at muscle tissue. We will study it much more deeply in a future chapter, so here's just an overview. Muscle tissue is contractile tissue. That means it shortens. So the actual tissue can just become shorter. Not because something else is pressing it, it just becomes shorter. It is also highly vascular. That means there are blood vessels going all through this tissue. Very metabolically active, meaning it uses a lot of energy and it has a high degree of innervation. Lot of nerves going to this tissue. Okay, so the function of it is that it generates force to move body structures. You know what muscles are and what they do. But in addition to the movement component of its function, they also generate heat and they also form extra protection around our viscera. Right here in my abdominal pelvic cavity, I don't have any bony structures to protect. And underneath to protect my organs, and underneath my skin, and a little bit of a fat layer, more or less depending on the year. Underneath that, there are several layers of muscles, and they protect my viscera. Very important in that particular area specifically. There are voluntary and involuntary muscles, meaning muscles that I can voluntarily contract. I can say, hey, fingers bend, and these muscles are contracting when I want them to contract. Same with the muscles of my face right now while I'm talking and blinking, etc. But there are also involuntary muscles, like my heart is pumping and I am not consciously controlling that. I cannot tell it to stop. I cannot tell it to speed up consciously, as well as muscles around my blood vessels that make the blood vessels dilated or contracted. I can't control that. Okay, so there are 3 specific types of muscles, and they're skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Let's look at some of their features. Skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. So these are muscles that are generally attached to your skeleton. And they are attached to your skeleton by tendons. Remember, those are dense, regular connective tissue to move bones. So if I've got a muscle right here, it's connected up here to a bone. It's connected over here to a bone. And when this muscle shortens, it brings this bone closer to that bone, right? So I am voluntarily telling my arm to do this. However, just FYI, not all skeletal muscle is connected to bones, to the skeleton, right? I have muscles around here, orbicularis oris, that allows me to do all of these kinds of movements, and those are just attached to my skin. But they're still structurally and functionally the same, so we still call them skeletal muscle. That's a tissue type. The cells are arranged in long, generally parallel lines, and the skeletal muscle cells are very long. They are also multinucleated. So if we look over here at this image, this whole cylinder here in the middle is a part of one cell. It continues, like we don't even know where it ends. Right here to the left of it is another cell. Again, keeps going, and here's a third cell. So we have one cell, second cell with a tiny bit of space in between, third cell, and it looks like a tiny part of a fourth cell. These cells are densely packed with contractile proteins that allow the shortening to happen. And they're like these ropey long proteins that are just like laying like a stack of logs all throughout the cell and taking up almost all of that space. So the nuclei are like, I'm going to get out of the way, and they're smashed against the plasma membrane of these skeletal muscle cells. So you can see this kind of oval thing smashed. I'm imagining like plasma membrane is like a window screen and you have the nucleus like smashed in it because the rest of the space is taken up by these proteins. The cells of skeletal muscles have many nuclei within a single cell. And this is because of the origin or how these cells developed from when we were embryos until now. More on that later. Okay. And the way that those proteins that contract, those proteins that are taking up the entire inside of the cell are organized, it makes it look like they have these stripes, which we call striations. They're rather visible. So, skeletal muscle cells are long, cylindrical. They are striated. That's this dark light pattern. They have multiple nuclei smashed to the periphery of the cell. And these muscles are generally under voluntary control, used for motion, posture, heat production, like when you're shivering or when you're running on a cold day. And as I mentioned before, protection of your internal organs. Smooth muscles, so smooth. Smooth muscles look quite different. They are pisiform. They have this like tapered on both ends look. And they only have one nucleus. They're also much, much smaller and not cylindrical. I got a cat here. To say pisiform, I meant fusiform. Pisiform is another sciencey word. A fusiform is the shape that I meant though. They have no striations, so you don't see those patterns because the proteins that allow smooth muscles to shorten and contract, they are arranged inside of that cell in a totally different pattern, so it doesn't provide that dark light kind of striping that we saw. They are also involuntary, so we cannot control them consciously. They are regulated by a part of our nervous system that we call autonomic nervous system, and that is generally out of our control. So they are in many locations, including surrounding blood vessels, around the digestive system. So your whole tube of the digestive system has these smooth muscles around it. Respiratory tract, uterus is a very large and strong smooth muscle. Involuntary sphincters, like the internal anal sphincter, and urinary tract. And finally, the third type of muscle is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. So cardio means heart. These are involuntary muscle, or these muscle cells are involuntary. We cannot control them consciously, if they contract and how fast and how frequently. But of course, our nervous system subconsciously controls this. They are striated, meaning they do have that light dark banding pattern, that stripy pattern. They are generally uninucleate. They only have one nucleus, although some cells may have two, but let's just say there are one nucleus. And one thing that makes them pretty noticeably different from skeletal muscle is that these cells branch. So they are branched patterns, and where the branching happens, there are these darker lines called intercalated discs. Okay, so one heart cell is called cardiac cell or cardiocyte, and it's connected with a neighboring cardiocyte through these connections that are called intercalated discs. They're only found in between heart cells. And what they are is a bunch of proteins that form gap junctions and desmosomes, if you remember from the beginning of this chapter. This is to allow quick coordination of contraction, right? So if the cell is branched, it can have communication with multiple neighbors because it's connecting to branch to two neighbors. This is the most metabolically active type of muscle, right? It is constantly working It has a lot of large mitochondria to produce ATP for all of that contracting, because every time you contract, you need ATP for that to happen. We will learn more about cardiac muscle in a future class, but this muscle has a limited ability to recover from damage, and that is why heart attacks can be fatal, is because if a large enough area of the heart is damaged by a heart attack, that area will not be regenerated, and a heart can't work without all those cells that have been, now they're damaged, not working. So looking at the three different kinds of images here, you'll see that most of them look very similar. Yeah. Do you guys see the little paw? Come on, buddy. They stain pink. The nuclei stain purple. You can see here on the left, long cylinders, lots of nuclei, stripy pattern. In the middle, you see stripy pattern, but it's not quite as clean. You see the branching with some spaces in between and intercalated discs, those dark structures. The smooth muscle kind of looks like it could be all kinds of different tissues. So you'll just need to have some experience to see that, okay, that butt is very close to my face, to see that this is a smooth muscle and indeed and not. What a lot of people confuse it with is dense, regular connective tissue. So it just takes some practice to be able to tell them apart, and I hope that in class we'll be able to do that. Okay, so you have your work cut out for you to be able to identify connective tissue by sight for lab, right? For lecture, you want to be able to tell me the general function of each type of and sorry, I said connective tissue, but I meant all tissue. You need to tell me the general function of each tissue. You need to tell me an example or a couple of examples of where that tissue can be found, and definitely link that structure to function. There are also some very specific things you need to know, like cell types, fiber types, some structural characteristics of. Okay, I have extra kids in my house because of the snow days, and I have friends who are nurses who had to go into work. So it's a little cray-cray in here between the cats and the kids. All right, so for lab, your work is cut out for you. Please go to open labs to look at these actually under microscopes. But look at your success guide, the lab list of stuff you need to know to really understand what you need to know about these tissues. For lecture, it is basically everything else that is in these presentations that is not identifying them visually. Okay. Oh, shoot. I forgot. Nervous tissue. Wow. There's only the one slide. Of nervous tissue. We will look at nervous tissue really in more detail toward the end of the term, which is just in a few weeks. And nervous tissue has these very unique looking cells that are called neurons, really kind of taking center stage. There are these smaller dots all around, and those are the second type of cell that are way more prominent, I should say. Maybe not prominent. Numerous, way more numerous in neural tissue, and those are glial cells. So neurons and glial cells are two types of cells that are found in nervous tissue. Neurons are generally way bigger and more prominent in an image, like you can see here. So there's a neuron with these like projections. Here's another neuron, this whole dark purple thing with projections. There's a nucleus in there, another neuron, another neuron nucleus and projections. And all of these long things are projections of the neuron. They are not fibers. And then all these other smaller cells are called glial cells, and they are much, much, much more numerous and very important supporting cells. We will learn a lot about nervous tissue in the future. For now, you just need to know these two cell types that are in the nervous tissue, be able to identify this kind of an image, and know that the main function of the nervous tissue is to communicate. Which types of muscle tissue is or are under involuntary control? What type of muscle is this? Ooh, that's a good one. Oh, my nervous tissue slides got shifted. Okay, well, here's the summary. Located in brain, spinal cord, and nerves, conducts electrical impulses for the function of communication. And we will learn a lot more about it. Two basic types of cells, neurons and neuroglia, which are also called glia. All right. We will talk about the details of these cells in future chapters, so you do not need to worry about that right now. There are just a couple of things to bring all of this together and finish up the chapter. And I want to just take another few minutes to talk about membranes of the body. In context of cells, membranes meant a very, very specific thing, and that was phospholipid bilayer, and that's what a cellular membrane is. However, on a larger scale, when we're talking about an organ system, membranes mean something much more diverse. In the context of cells, we learned that membranes means something very, very specific, and that is a phospholipid bilayer. Two layers of phospholipids, they create all of the cellular membranes. However, on a larger scale, when we're talking about body organs or organ systems, membranes means just like a kind of flattened protective sheet of something. Okay? And these are made of epithelial tissue of some kind plus connective tissue layers. And there can be more or less connective tissue. So these membranes line body cavities and body surfaces for protection and other functions. And there are 4 body membrane types based on their structure: mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membrane, and synovial membranes. Very briefly, mucous membranes, they line body cavities that are open to the outside. Okay, so think about places open to the outside. Mouth, right? Your nose, your vagina. These require special treatment, protection. Okay? They also allow absorption, secretion, right? We can secrete mucus to protect and moisten a lot of these openings, and we can absorb or like interact with the things that we're like smelling and eating, right? They're important for preventing infection of the body, and there is an epithelial layer of cells with a modified epithelial cell here. Who remembers what this cell is called? A goblet cell that secretes mucus, and then you have some cilia that kind of move that mucus around and sweep and brush through it. And mucus is a thick, slippery fluid that's going to rest on top here. Okay. The epithelial layer, the epithelial tissue of mucous membranes, sits at the basement membrane. It sits on areolar connective tissue. And that areolar connective tissue that supports epithelial tissue of mucous membranes is called lamina propria. And I think that's all we need to know. You're already familiar with serous membranes, and they line our viscera, right? And the purpose of these membranes is to reduce friction in general. They are really, really thin, one layer, so simple squamous epithelial cells that rest at their basement membrane on areolar connective tissue. And this epithelium the epithelium that makes up serous membranes is called mesothelium or mesothelium. Okay. So together, mesothelium and areolar tissue creates a serous membrane, and it makes up both parietal and visceral layer of serous membrane. And they will vary a tiny bit depending on whether we're talking about pericardium or pleura or peritoneum, the different serous membranes, the specific ones that are in the body. But these cells, the epithelial cells, they also produce serous fluid, and that fluid lubricates the movement, right, and fills up the serous cavities and allows the visceral layer of the serous membrane to rub against the parietal layer when the organ inside of it is moving or expanding or shrinking. Okay, and these membranes, they cover organs that are not exposed to surfaces or the outside. Synovial membranes are very non-membrane-like, but they are these layers that line joint cavities. Okay. We will talk about them a lot in a future chapter, but one thing you need to know for now is that they do not have any epithelium at all, unlike all the other membranes we've looked at so far, or all the other membranes we will look at. And they also produce fluid for various purposes, okay? And these joint cavities have a very specific function for the health of the joint, and we'll discuss it in a future lecture. Finally, cutaneous membranes. You just have the cutaneous membrane that covers your body. So it's the skin, it's covering the outer surface of the body. It is made of two layers of tissue, which is epidermis. Epidermis is made up of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next chapter. And the dermis, which is the layer under the epithelium, which is made up of areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. Again, we will look at this in a lot of detail in the next chapter. Quick quiz. Go ahead and pause. Tissue repair. What is tissue repair? You know what this means. It's the process of replacing worn out, damaged, or dead cells and tissue that's not functioning as it should with healthy cells and new cell products, right? So the fibers and the ground substance. I am going crazy between the kids and the cats. What does tissue repair depend on? Okay, tissue repair depends on several important factors. First, some tissue is able to be repaired much better than other types of tissue for various reasons. And we will look at some of those reasons in just a moment. Okay. Oh my gosh. But so those things we cannot change. There's nothing you can do about it. However, there are some things that we can do to help in tissue repair. Good nutrition, right, is really important because what we eat is the building blocks of the new tissue that we're forming. It's also important to have good circulation for tissue repair. And here comes a couple of things. Good circulation, we have some control over as we're moving around and have healthy hearts. It can, okay, yes, have a seat. It can help you have good circulation. However, if you remember, there are some tissue types that are avascular. They don't have blood going directly to that tissue. Can you name any tissues that are avascular? So epithelial tissue is avascular, and cartilage is avascular. All types of cartilage are avasculars. Also regular, dense regular connective tissue is less vascular than some other tissues. So what that means is, in order for oxygen, nutrients from the blood to come and support that tissue, those nutrients and oxygen, they have to diffuse from the blood vessels and to whatever tissue is around the blood vessels, and then it has to diffuse to the next layer of cells, until it gets to these avascular tissues that we're talking about. So the further you are away from the blood vessel, the longer it will take for all these nutrients and oxygen to get to you. And when it takes longer, that means the tissue repair will take longer and may not be as complete. Okay. So epithelial cells, although they don't have immediate blood flow to them, they are always attached to connective tissue, like areolar connective tissue, that is very, very vascular. So they have a relatively good blood supply in most cases. We will talk about the exception in our skin in a future chapter. But what helps epithelial tissue be so renewable is the fact that there are stem cells in epithelial tissue that always provide a source of new cells. And I will tell you a little bit more about stem cells in just a second. Connective tissues have different capacities from renewal, and some has complete renewal and quick renewal to minimal, like cartilage and dense regular connective tissue that are less vascular. Muscle and nervous tissue have very poor capacity for cell renewal, and this is not because they are vascular. They are actually very vascular tissues. However, it is because they do not have stem cells available for regeneration. So we need to have stem cells for regeneration, as well as good access to blood flow. Okay. As we learn about nervous tissue, muscular tissue, and etc., we will learn specifically about tissue repair in those places. Okay. Some important terms that I'd like you to be familiar with for this chapter about tissue change and aging. Metaplasia is when epithelial tissue that lines respiratory airways changes from pseudostratified ciliated to stratified squamous, and this is due to damage from smoking generally. Hypertrophy happens when there's overall increase, like hyper, right? Increase in the size of cells in a particular tissue. So this is the size, the cells get bigger. Hyperplasia is when you get more cells in a tissue, okay? Neoplasia is the out of control growth of cells within a tissue which form a tumor, right? That tumor can be benign or it can be cancerous. And when tissues age, they generally will lose their ability to regenerate and renew as quickly as they were before. Epithelia will get thinner, connective tissues lose their pliability, and the repair processes are less efficient. We will talk about these aging processes as we talk about specific organs and organ systems in the future. So the last slide of this very, very long chapter, and it's about stem cells. You probably have heard about stem cells before. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Stem cells can undergo mitosis, so they can divide to become at least two different types of cells to differentiate. So it's kind of like the raw material that if we have on reserve in our tissues at all times, we can always make more cells that we need for that particular tissue. Well, as adults, we have some stem cells in various parts of our bodies, but they are limited in what they can do. Whereas embryos, or even before that, like blastocysts, have stem cells that can be a lot of different types of things. So let's look at those two different types of stem cells. There are embryonic stem cells, and that means that those are stem cells that are found in an embryo. So as we were developing, remember, an egg gets fertilized by a sperm that makes a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg. And then that zygote undergoes mitosis to create two identical cells, which go through mitosis to create four identical cells, and on until you have this hollow ball of identical small cells. We talked about this at the very beginning of this chapter, and then that hollow ball kind of starts invaginating on itself, creating those layers that will later become endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm, right? Well, before those cells really differentiate into those three embryonic tissue types, when we're still a blastocyst, all of those cells can become any cell in the body. And that sometimes means that clump of cells can sometimes kind of like break into two clumps, and each clump will develop into a human being. And that's how we have identical twins. Well, let's look at specifics about those stem cells. Stem cells that are formed between when you have the zygote and when you have the morula, which you don't need to know what that is, but it's a clump of mitotically divided cells from the zygote. Those cells are called totipotent. That means they can become any cell in the body at all, and they can become cells that create the placenta. Okay. If you let it's not even an embryo yet, but if you let that clump of cells develop and continue to develop, then later in the stage of embryonic development, those cells are pluripotent, and that means that those are the stem cells that are derived from a certain part of the blastocyst, and those stem cells can become any future cell of the body, except they can't become the placenta, but they can become cells of any cell in the future human body. Okay. Now, embryo develops, those cells start to differentiate, they start to create endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and then eventually those tissues will become, connective tissue and skin and muscle and nervous tissue and all of that. And eventually there will be some cells that are set aside in all those developed organs that are going to be called multipotent cells. And those are adult stem cells that are found mostly in the bone marrow of adults that are capable of differentiating into a few types of cells that are all generally related in function. A few type of cells, maybe 2 or 3 type of cells. Finally, in many of our tissues that regenerate well, like epithelial tissue, which regenerates really well, and many types of connective tissue that regenerate really well, we have amongst those cells of that tissue, we have a few cells that are unipotent stem cells. And they have the ability to divide by mitosis, And when one cell divides and creates two daughter cells, one of those daughter cells becomes an epithelial cell and the other cell remains a unipotent stem cell. So that means that these cells can only differentiate into one particular type of cell and regenerate another one of those stem cells that can again become only one particular cell type. Okay, so as I mentioned in the previous couple of slides about tissue repair, a particular tissue has the ability to repair that depends on whether it has stem cells that are part of that tissue. If it does have stem cells, then it will have the ability to regenerate, like epithelial tissue, whereas if it doesn't, like most neural tissue and cardiac muscle, then it will not regenerate. So once the cells die, you can't replace them. Die due to injury or overuse or whatever. So that's it. I think it's been a long chapter. Good job. Organize your stuff, go over it, teach your imaginary friend, or get together with your study group and let me know if you have any questions.